So here you have the main points that we are going to see now. We are going to see the definition of the GDP, so the gross domestic product. Then we are going to see some of the limitations that this indicator of one economy has. Also, we are going to talk about those variables that are not included in the GDP, in the estimation of that GDP. And then we are going to see, when we are still in the nominal GDP, we are going to see how is the way of estimating that variable. In fact, we have three ways of getting that variable: from the supply side, from the income side, and finally for the demand side. Here we are going to see the last one. So when I'm talking about demand, which is equivalent to total expenditure or consumption. And finally, we are going to see the main difference between the nominal versus the real GDP, and why, when we are evaluating the GDP over time, the only way of getting the best estimation of the evaluation of the behavior over time of that variable always is real GDP. Nominal is not really bad when you are talking about just 1 year. It's not perfect, but it's okay. But when you are evaluating how is the production of one economy over time, always you have to use real GDP. So GDP is basically the whole production, that is done inside of an economy, within the national boundaries of that economy. It doesn't matter who is consuming that production, doesn't matter the nationality of the production factor that is behind of that production. So it's the whole production inside of one economy. That is going to be for a period of time, okay? Normally a year. So that's why we talk about this variable as a stock variable. It's not a flow variable, it's a stock variable. So the whole production over a specific period of time within the national boundaries of one economy, and always also in monetary terms. So the production is something physical, because we want to have just one data, no the total number of cars on one side, the total number of houses, the total number of tables. Instead of that, we just want one data to evaluate, to see the capacity of production of one economy, well, the actual production of one economy. That's why the only way of getting that is all the production, all the physical production, put that in the same variable, in the same terms, so in monetary terms. So that is going to be, in a certain way, one of the possible, it's not limitation, but when we are going to see this variable over time, here we are going to have like something that can introduce a sort of noise, okay? Because the prices can change over time. So, as I said then, when we are talking about nominal GDP, is the whole production inside of one economy for a period of time and in monetary terms. As I told you, when we are estimating the GDP and we use that variable, sometimes we are going to have, or we are going to face some limitation of the variable. Some of them are going to be easy to resolve, others you need an additional indicator, an additional variable to measure the aspect that you are looking for. So one of them is size. Is if you just considering the GDP, so the whole production of one economy, and you want to compare that economy with a different economy, you can face a problem like you have, for instance, Russia with a really big GDP versus Switzerland with a smaller. The thing that you want to evaluate with GDP, with production, in fact is something that has to be with welfare. How is people living in that economy in economic terms? So if you are just looking at the GDP and you want to compare two economies, here you are facing a side problem. In fact, you are observing that the GDP of Russia is much higher than Switzerland, but people in Switzerland are living better than in Russia. So what's going on there? What can you do? Instead of just using the GDP, the thing that you need is GDP per capita. So if you take your GDP and divide that GDP by the number of people who is living there, so by the population, you are going to get a better estimation of the welfare of that people. Okay, so that is one of the limitations if you just are considering the GDP instead of GDP per capita. Other variable that can be problematic or under a different dimension in which you can face trouble, as I told you previously, GDP is quantity multiplied by prices. So because you want that variable in monetary terms, your goal when you are observing GDP is trying to know the level of production of one economy. So your goal is just evaluate the production and how does that production change over time. But you need that production in the same units. Instead of just car, tables, I don't know, many different products or machines that has been produced, you need just one data. So the thing that you are doing is getting all those physical variables into monetary variables, and then you can sum all of them. So by sure you're going to need prices. It's the only way of getting those physical units, production of things in monetary terms. So you need prices, but it's something that you need to get the estimation of GDP in monetary terms. But it's not your goal evaluating the evolution of prices. When you are getting the GDP year by year, the thing that you are doing is quantities by prices. Quantity of the next year by the prices of the next year. And the problem of that is that it's not just production, the thing that can change over time, but also the prices. So that's why the nominal GDP is not a good instrument to see how is the evolution of that production in that economy over time. Instead of that, we are going to see that the best alternative is using the real GDP. Because in that case, the thing that we are going to do is fix the prices. Okay, you need prices because you need those physical units in monetary terms. So that is the only way. So you have a car and you need the price of the car. And then you are able to have the production, the value of the production of that car. So prices is something that you need to have that car in monetary terms. But because your goal is not observing the evolution of prices, but the evolution of quantity over time, the thing that we are going to do in that case is fixing the prices in 1 year, the base year. And then we are going to use always the same prices over the different quantities that we are going to observe over time. So when we are going to look at that real GDP and the evolution of that variable, the thing that we are going to see is the actual evolution of quantity, and that is the thing that we want to get. So here is real GDP. More things that we are not considering when we are just looking at the GDP, the whole production. Well, environmental issues. Production also is going to involve, that when you are producing, you are generating pollution and those kind of things. That is not something that you are looking for when you are getting that production. So it's a negative externality, and that is going to be there. And when we are just observing production, we are not considering that cost that is also the cost of production. It's something that we are going to suffer. Income distribution. It can be the case that the GDP of one economy is more or less okay, but inside of that economy we have people with really high level of income versus the other part of the population with a really low level of income. So also it's important considering how is the distribution, the income distribution in its economy, and with the GDP you are not getting that. Okay. Also, for instance, can be the time for leisure. Production is good, okay, but when we are observing the production, the main goal of getting the production of one economy is It's because we are trying to get an indicator about the welfare. So, because we are assuming that as higher is the GDP, or better said, the GDP per capita, better is going to be the people there. But what about the leisure? That is also an indicator of welfare. And that GDP, or that estimation of the production of the economy, is not considered in aspects like this. Now we are going to see all those activities that are not included in the GDP of one economy. We can start with the domestic tax, like taking care of the children or others, or just cooking, cleaning the house. As you know, that is not included in the GDP. Neither is going to be all those illegal activities that happen in an economy, like be it prostitution or drug traffic or things like that. Neither that activity which is legal, but the people that is doing that activity don't want the government to know about that. So I'm talking about the submergent economy. Why is that? Because that people, the thing that they don't want to do is paying taxes. So that's why they are not going to register, they are not going to declare that activity. So if we don't have that declaration, we are not able to see that activity. And neither is going to be the second-hand market. Why is that? Because here we are going to talk about the production that is done in a specific year. When we are talking about the second-hand market, we are talking about a production that was done 1, 2, or even more years before. That is not actual production for this current year. It's production that was considered in the GDP when that production was done in that specific year. Imagine a car. I'm buying a car that is a second-hand car. It was produced in 2000. But now I'm buying that good. I can consider that as production for this year, because that car was produced in 2000, and in fact that car, the value of that car is inside of the GDP of that year, of the 2000, okay? So that's why all the production that is not done in the year in which we are evaluating the GDP, that is not going to be considered in the estimation of the GDP of that current year, okay? Because that is something that was done before, so it's in the GDP of the specific year in which it was done, what's produced. Neither is going to be all the intermediate consumption. What is that? Because when we are considering production, we are just looking the whole production, the final production that is done in 1 year. So imagine a car, as I said previously. So you have the whole car, and you are going to see the value of that car. You are not going to consider the intermediate consumption. What is that? When you are producing the car, that car is made by many different components, by many different intermediate goods or intermediate consumption. So it's going to be a mistake if you introduce, okay, the value of the car, and then the value of the wheels of the car, and then also the value of the chassis and the value of the different components of the car. That is a mistake, because you are overestimating the GDP. If you just want to see the total production, forget about the intermediate step. Just look at the final production, because that is the total production. Otherwise, you're going to have the total production, the final production, plus in more than one time the different elements that compose that final production. Okay? So, we are going to see some exceptions in terms that, okay, also it's true that you can have a car, that's GDP, and also you can have some wheels that it was production, but they didn't get to be in a car. In that case, we are going to consider the wheels, but because we are going to consider those wheels that are not in any car as a final production, okay? So final production is always that you have the good that is not going to be part of a different good. Okay, so it can be the whole car or those wheels or chassis that you have that they are the production that is done, but they are not yet in a final good. Okay, so when we are estimating the GDP, we can include intermediate consumption, otherwise we are going to overestimate the GDP. So let's see in more detail the difference between final production or final goods or services and intermediate goods, production or services. Okay, so we are going to say that final production or final goods are those goods with a clear final consumer. So it's like they have been done and that they are going to be sold. It's just for the final destination. Okay, it's not going to be something to be part of other things. It's just for consumption. But also we are going to introduce all the material, raw material or intermediate components that it has been produced, but we didn't have time enough to get those components inside of the final good. Imagine you are at the first, you are in December, 31st of December, you have wheels, but you didn't have time to put those wheels in the final production that is the car, right? So, because you didn't have time, as I told you, that is production. Okay, it's going to be part of anything else, but it's production of that year. So you have to consider those wheels as production. So all those components that you didn't have time to introduce in what is going to be the final good. So that good that is already designated for the final consumption. Okay? So we are going to make that exception because the goal here is getting the whole production. Okay? So that's why you are going to consider also as a final, so as GDP, not just those goods that are done, but all the components, raw material that have been elaborated, what is production there, that is not included in the final production. Then what is intermediate goods? Those goods that we are not going to introduce are going to be all those goods or components that are going to be part of the final good. So it's like they are going to die along of the process of production because they are going to disappear and they are going to convert in something else that is going to be the final production. So as I was saying before, you have many components to produce the car, but you are just going to consider the car as a final production, and you are not going to introduce inside of the GDP also its component of the car. So on one side car, final, and then also the intermediate goods, wheels, chassis and so on. No, that part of production, that elements that are going to die to become a different good that is going to be the final good, all those components are not going to be included in the production of the economy, in the GDP. Why? Because you are already considering all of them by the final good. Okay? It's not the thing that you are not going to consider that production. No. You are going to consider that production, but as a just look in the final picture. So the good when it's done. Instead of that plus the other thing. Okay? Because if you are doing that, as I told you, you are going to overestimate the GDP. So here I'm going to give you some examples to try to see when we are talking about final good or an intermediate good. So here we have the flour. Imagine that flour is bought by a household. That is the final destination. So that's why this is going to be consumption. But imagine the same product, the same good, that now is bought by a firm that is producing bread. So that is an input of the final output, which is bread. You can see now that the flour is going to be part of a process. So you're going to get the flour that is sort of going to die because it's going to become part of the final good, which is bread. So when you are evaluating the whole production, in that case, you are going to consider just the value of bread. No, you're not going to see, okay, how many units of bread it was done in this economy and how many units of flours in total it has been done. No, 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 no. Instead of that, you're going to see, okay, the whole flour that is sold to the household, because that is final production. And the whole amount of bread, without considering the flour that was sold to the firm that is producing bread. Otherwise, you're going to have the flour twice. One as a flour here for that company, and a flour inside of the bread that is produced by the firm. So here we're going to have, in this case, final consumption, where here that good is going to be intermediate consumption. Okay, so that's why there we are not going to consider the value of flour, just the value of bread. And here I have a different example with a tricky part. Why? What is the thing, the good here? It's a car. When a household is buying the car, we don't have any doubt. That is final consumption, because that is the final destination of the car, okay? Being driven by a family. But what about when it's a firm, the economic agent that is buying the car? Here also is going to be a consumption, a final consumption, okay? It's not going to be an intermediate consumption, though it's a company, the one that is buying the good. How is that? Because the car is not going to die, it's not going to be part of the final good, okay? In fact, the thing that we are observing is a firm that is buying an object with the final use that car in the economic activity. It doesn't matter. That car was done not to be part of another good. It's to be used as a final destination, and because that is the final destination of the car, also is a consumption, okay? So just take a look of the difference. Here the flour inside of the output of the company. So that's why you are not going to introduce the flour, because it's already in the bread, in that good, the bread. Here is something different. The car, imagine that it's the same company. The car is not going to be part of the bread, okay? Otherwise, it's not a good bread. It's something that it was produced with a final destination that is serve for driving, imagine that bread to other places. But it's not part of the bread. So if you want to see the whole production in that economy, you have to consider all the cars that have been sold to the households, but also its production, all those cars that are now in the hands of firms. It's production. We have cars that have been done. So that's why it's also GDP, it's final goods. So that's why we introduce also all the cars that companies are to get estimation of the GDP just using the approach of expenditure, of demand approach, or consumption approach. All of them are the same thing. The thing that we need to have is the consumption of the different economic agents that we can find in one economy. In fact, here we have all of the economic agents. The government can spend money in buying goods or services, so that is production, so that's why it's GDP. Households, when they are buying also, they are buying something that have been produced previously, firms, or the rest of the world. When we are talking about the rest of the world, it's like, okay, we are living in an economy like Spain. Rest of the world is when people from abroad is buying goods that have been made in Spain. So it's production inside of our economic, our physical barriers. So that means GDP, domestic product, production. So gross domestic product. So we are going to use the G when the government is spending money. C when the economic agent that is behind of that consumption is households. I for firms, and X for export. Because production, the domestic production, means all the production that is made inside of the economy, but it doesn't matter who is consuming that. So even in the case that that production is consumed abroad, I'm going to consider that information. That is production inside of the economy, that is GDP, okay? So the thing that we are going to observe here is that the GDP, so the whole domestic production inside of one economy, it can be calculated as the sum of consumption, so when families are buying, investment, when firms is the economic agent that is buying, G for government, and X for export. But also, so when the other people from abroad, from the rest of the world, is consuming goods that were made at home. And we are going to then subtract the imports. What is import? Imports are all those goods and services that have been produced abroad, but we are buying them. Why we have to subtract that variable? We are going to see later on why is that, what is the reason that is behind that, okay? Well, as I was telling you, now we are going to get an estimation of the production, but using the consumption of the different economic agents. How is that possible? Because when you are consuming something, it's because previously has been produced. So it's a way of getting that estimation of production. Nevertheless, we can say that that is a strong assumption, the thing that we are doing here, because we are assuming that the whole production made in 1 year is also consumed, and it doesn't have to be the case. We can find cases in which the production made at the end of the year is not consumed because we didn't have time to do that. Or vice versa, also we can find consumption that is not about the production of the year. How is that possible? Imagine that I'm buying a car that is cheaper than others just because it was produced 1 year before or 2 years before. So if I am estimating the production, observing consumption, I'm making a mistake because I'm introducing through consumption a car that wasn't produced that year. In fact, was produced 2 years ago. So that's why I'm saying that we are like assuming or making a strong assumption. Nevertheless, we are going to introduce a variable to fix that problem. That variable is going to be here instead of investment, and it's going to be called inventory investment. In that inventory investment new variable, we are going to be able to solve those cases in which production is not equal to consumption, okay? So in the way that we are going to make the correction, the necessary correction to guarantee that the whole consumption is going to equal the production. So, but that we are going to see that later on. More things. Well, when we are estimating the GDP for a given year in nominal terms, so I mean using the prices of that year, nominal prices, not constant prices, nominal prices, those prices can be in two ways, or we have like two kinds of prices in nominal terms: market prices and basic prices. What is the difference? These are the prices when the good is just produced and is like going away from the firm without any government intervention there. Market prices is when the government is introducing taxes that is going to increase the price, the final price, the market price, or can be also subsidies for the production. That is going to make lower the market price, because when a government is introducing a subsidies is to make more competitive that industry, so that industry is able to charge lower prices. So that's why we can talk about market prices or basic prices, and the difference is intervention of the government, because here we are talking about consumption. That consumption has gone through the market, so by sure the prices are going to be market prices, okay? That's why by this estimation, by this approach of GDP, by sure we are going to have that GDP market prices. If we want to get the basic prices, we need to do just the opposite. So if our taxes with a positive signs, go here with a negative signs. And subsidies negative, so goes with the positive signs. And then we are going to get estimation, but not in market prices, in basic prices, okay? So now we are going to go variable by variable, explaining what is the meaning, what is inside of that variable, and then we are going to be able to see how we are going to manage the not equal or perfect equal production consumption variables through investment, and also we are going to explain why we introduce this imports variable with a minus. Okay, import is when you are buying goods from abroad. Just keep in mind that. So consumption, how is the way of quantifying that value, or what is behind that consumption variable? All the goods and services that has been consumed by families or households. So all of them, it doesn't matter the origin of that. So it can be production from the economy where these people is living, or also it can be goods that have been buy from abroad, so import. That's why we have that under our statistics, the thing that we have is the whole consumption. So consumption of internal goods plus consumption of external goods. So the meaning of that is, if I'm just evaluating the production of one economy, observing consumption, and in the case, specifically in the case of the households, I'm considering this variable, the thing that I'm going to do is introduce something that is not real production. When we are talking about GDP, as I told you, it's the production inside of one economy. But here we have goods that have been produced inside, okay, internal, this is perfect. But the problem is this, we are talking about those goods that are part of the consumption of household, but those goods have been produced outside. So if I want to estimate the GDP using that, I'm going to overestimate the GDP. So I need a way to subtract this term, and then I'm going to have a good estimation of production observing consumption in this case. Let's see what's going on with the other variables. Investment. Now we're going to see what is behind of investment. Investment is all that consumption of goods and services that is coming from firms, from companies. So here we are not talking about financial investment, okay? That is something different. In economics we have like two kinds of investments. Financial investment is when we are talking about financial goods, financial assets, like can be when we are talking about stock markets, shares, of those kind of things, of financial stuff. And when we are talking about something real, when I'm saying real, it's because I'm talking about production. Can be goods or services. But when a company is like buying those things, okay? So investment here is associated with production. In fact, keep in mind that here the thing that we want to get is the estimation of the production of one economy through the consumption of the different economic items. So if we have a car, that car can be consumed by, for instance, firms. So that car that is not part of the final goods, just keep in mind, it's not the same thing. A final consumption or an intermediate consumption. The flour, it was intermediate consumption because it's part of the final good, which was bread. Now here we are talking about like the car. Okay, I want to get estimation of the production of one economy, including the car that was bought by a company. So I have to consider also those cars that have been bought by the different companies, and that is the thing that I'm doing. So I'm evaluating, I'm quantifying the production by the consumption, also by firms, not just households, but also firms and more economic items, as I told you previously. So basically, this investment is going to have that, okay? So it's all the consumption by firms. And that is going to be the big part of one of the two elements that this variable has. Those two elements are, on one side, gross fixed capital formation. Here you can find also it's the same thing. And as I told you, there is going to be the main consumption, equipment, okay? All those things that are necessary to produce more things. But those things that are physical, okay, or services, production. And then we are going to have inventory investment. What is inside of gross fixed capital formation, a part of equipment? Also, we are going to introduce here something that is coming from the household consumption. So we should expect that it could be in the other variable, I mean the C, coming from consumption, but it's going to be here. And what is that? Is all the consumption or the investment that the households make in the real estate market or real estate sector, okay? So when a family is buying a house or something like that, that money is going to be here, okay? So that is one of the big part of investment, but also we are going to have inventory investment. If you remember, this variable is going to help us to make the correction for those cases in which production is not equal to consumption. Here we want to get the production by using consumption. And thanks to this, we are going to be able to get that. This variable can be positive or negative. It's going to be positive always that the production is higher than the consumption, right? Because it's production minus consumption. So if this value is higher than this is going to be positive, so it's going to enter with a positive sign inside of investment, so it's going to increase the GDP. Which cases? As I told you, one example of that is I have a production, imagine that is a car, that is the value, for instance, but I didn't sell the car. It was at the end of the year. So I have a production, the consumption is 0, the value of this is 100, that is going to be with a positive sign here, so in investment is going to increase the production, the estimation of production. The production is the production, but my estimation now is going to be better. If I'm just observing consumption, I'm making these mistakes. I have this car, it was produced but it's not consumed, but thanks to this I can introduce the value of that car. Or vice versa, I'm buying a car now, and it's cheaper than others, but that is possible because it was produced 2 years ago, so it's not real production. The value of this is minus 50. So it's going to be with a negative sign here. So that means it's going to decrease investment and then the estimation of production. It's perfect. Why? Because I have a consumption. If I just consider in consumption, I'm assuming that the consumption is like 50 units higher, but it's not real because that good was produced like 2 years ago. So, but thanks to this inventory investment, I'm fixing that mistake because this is with that negative terms, with that negative value, so it's eliminating that is overestimation of production coming from consumption. Now, before going with the next concept or the next kind of consumption, that is the one that is coming from the government, we are going to see the difference between investment, consumption, and intermediate consumption. Here we have two goods, okay? Car and flour. Flour, it can be used to produce bread, for instance. Let's start with the car. I think it's the easy one. When a company is buying a car, it's a good. It's something that is going to use for a long time and to produce. But so it's something like it's fixed, okay? That is going to be investment. When a company is buying a car, that car is going to be used in the company, but it's not part of the final good, is investment. More specifically, is gross fixed capital formation. It's fixed. and it's going to be part of the whole production, okay? The elements that produce. So it's to produce. When that car it was buy by a household, we are going to call that consumption, right? So depending on the ion, economic ion, it's going to have a different name. In fact, also here you can have the government buying that car, okay? And in that case, it's going to be public consumption, that as we are going to see later on. Flour. Imagine that a household buys flour, that the final destination of that good is to be consumed by a family. So that is final consumption and also is consumption, because it's a household, the economic ion that is buying that. And it's final, and that is the letter that we use for the case of household, families, I mean. But when we are talking about the same kind of good, flour, that was bought by a company that is producing bread, so that company is going to use that flour to produce bread, that is not going to be the final destination of that good. This is not going to be investment, because it's something that is going to be part of the final good. This is going to be an intermediate good, okay? So this is not consumption, it's just an intermediate good or intermediate consumption, okay? This part, you see, is different to the previous one. So check here, who is the economic ion and if the good is destined to the final objective of that good, so the final consumption. Here it could be a mistake, call this flour investment. It's not investment, it's going to be part of the final good, so it's going to die along the process of production. It's an intermediate good, and it's not going to be considered in the estimation of the GDP in the way in which it's going to be already in the final good. So when families buy bread, okay, bread from this company, that is going to be consumption. And that is going to be that flour. Now it's going to be part of the bread. Now we are going to see the consumption of the government, which is the other economic ions, a part of the foreign economies. So G is coming from government spending. Also you can say public spending. And that is going to be the consumption of goods and services coming from the government. It can be, for instance, all the things that you need to produce or has a hospital or a university or school or any kind of equipment that you can think that the government is providing. So goods and services that has been consumed by the government. That is production. We are going to get an approach of that production, just looking at the consumption of the government in this case. But as in the previous cases, we are going to see that the estimation of the public spending, of the government spending, is going to introduce all the consumption, the total one. So that means that we can find good that has been produced inside internal production, but also in that consumption there's going to be goods or machines or any kind of equipment that you can think that are coming from abroad, so external consumption. As in the previous cases, we are going to find a way to eliminate this element and then just keep the internal consumption coming from the government. Something that I want to emphasize is the difference between government spending and transfer. Transfer is going to be all that money that the government is giving in exchange of nothing. Okay? It's not the same thing, though this is the same economic ion, which is the government. Here we are talking about those kind of helps that the government gives to, for instance, students, people that has lost the the job or something like that. So we are talking about money coming from the government, but it's not in exchange of something. Just remember that the thing that we want to get here is the estimation of production. So in that case, when the government is spending that money, it's not in exchange of production. So if we consider that money, it's like we are overestimating the actual production of the economy, because those helps is in exchange of nothing. So there is no production behind that. Of course, they are really useful and they have a reason to be there, to exist. But it's not production. That's why we are not going to consider that money as a government spending, and we are going to call that money transfer, which are not going to be here of this G variable. And the last economic agent is the rest of the world. You can see that also like this. Rest of the world. It's when we are talking about the other economies, not our economy, but other countries, okay? So here we have basically export and import. Export is all the consumption coming from abroad, but the whole production of that export, it was done inside of the economy. So it's production that has been produced within our national boundaries. That's why it's going to be one good way of getting the estimation of the production of the economy. So export is when the production is internal, the total, so that is different with respect to the previous kind of consumption. Here the whole production was done inside of the economy. The thing is, it was bought by other people. I mean, people coming from abroad, the rest of the world. But it's production. It's our production. That's why it's going to be part of the estimation of the GDP using this approach. Import. Also, we are going to consider import. What is the import? Import is when we are buying. In general, we. Okay? We can be household, it can be the government, or it can be firms. So you can see now that we have here, with the total import of one economy, those elements that we wanted to eliminate of the other variable. Here we have that consumption, that though it's consumption here inside, but it's about production that is coming from abroad, for the case of household, government and firms. So where is going to be the mechanism to correct that the problem that we had before? It's going to be subtracting the imports. So we are going to see that the thing that we had previously was the total consumption, the total investment, the total public expenditure, export, and now we are considered minus import, because when you are doing minus import, the thing that you are actually doing is, because this is with a minus, it's like all these elements enters the equation with a minus. So in fact the thing that you are doing is eliminating this with this, you are eliminating this with this, and this with this. That is just possible because you are introducing that. So, and this is disappear because now it's inside, okay? You are going to get then the actual estimation, the real estimation of the GDP, considering only the goods and services that have been produced inside of the economy. So it's the actual GDP, internal production. So that's why when we are going to estimate the GDP, we use this general expression. We have the total consumption coming from the household, the total investment coming from the firms, so consumption of the companies, consumption of the government, the foreign consumption, minus import, because that is a way of correcting the consumption that is about goods that were not produced inside of the economy, okay? And that is the final function that we are going to use. Also, I want to say that these terms, sometimes you can have, instead of export minus import, I can give you the net export, okay? So we call X minus M, so export minus imports, net export. It can be positive, that is going to be always that the export is higher than the import, or negative. That is the case in which the imports, which are with the negative sign, are higher than the export. When this is positive, it's because we have a surplus, so the economy exporting more than the thing that they are importing, surplus, or just the opposite is a deficit, in which we are going to import or consume more from abroad than the production that we are selling. Okay, and that was the last part of this GDP estimation. Also, I want to mention that when you are doing this estimation of the GDP, you are getting the GDP at market prices. B. Market prices are by sure, because all of this production has passed by the market, and when you pass a good by the market, it's going to have the indirect taxes, or also it can have any kind of subsidies for the industry that is going to reduce, in that case, the price. Taxes are going to increase the price in the market. But because we are talking about here consumption, that means that by sure this production has passed through the market, so that's why we are going to see that market prices. They are prices in which we are adding the indirect taxes, so they are prices in which we are adding the indirect taxes, and in the case we are considering also the subsidies of that industry that are going to reduce the market price. So here we have seen how is the estimation of the GDP using the expenditure approach. We are not going to follow or continue with the other, but you must know that we have at least two other alternatives. One of them is the production approach or supply approach. It's the same thing. It's when we are considering the final production of in economy for the different goods. So final production, that means we are not considering the intermediate consumption, intermediate good, just the final production. Or also the other alternative approach is the income approach. We are assuming that the whole production is not just equal to consumption, but also is equal to the income produced in that economy. So I'm talking about the remuneration of all the production factors. So remember, basically we have two production factors, capital and labor. So the whole production, it has to be shared or divided in the remuneration of these two production factors. Workers is going to be through the wages of the workers, and the owner of capital is when we are talking about those benefits that are for the owner of the firm or the company. Okay, but as I told you, we are not going to analyze those cases. Instead of that, we are going to continue with these two concepts that we have here: nominal GDP versus real GDP. Well, GDP, as I told you at the beginning of this video, is really important as a way that is an approximation of the wealth, not the wealth, it's not the same, but the welfare of one economy. More specifically, instead of just considering the GDP, in that case we need the GDP per capita to have a better approach of the welfare of the citizens of that economy. One of the things that we want to analyze when we are talking about GDP as a way of seeing that welfare is observing the evolution of that variable over time. I want to see if the countries are better off with the time or they are getting worse. So evolution is going to be something important, interesting. But also you need to remember that GDP, the estimation of GDP, is in fact the quantity of the goods, so production, which is our goal, trying to know how is the production of one economy. The problem is that the production in physical units are really different things or goods, right? So you have cars, you have tables, you have houses, you have food. All of that is production. And you want to have just one data to know the whole production of one economy. That's why because it's impossible to have just one number adding physical units, that's why we need something to unify those units and then have them in the same units, which is, we are going to say, monetary units. So instead of having the number of cars, I want to know the value in monetary terms of that cars. The same thing for houses, food, or anything that you can think that can be produced. So that's why we need to multiply those things by the value of that things. Value, I'm talking about prices, okay? So that's why the nominal GDP, so the estimation of the GDP is the quantity of, for instance, cars times the price of each car. Then the next good, table, the number of tables times the price of each table, and so on. Then after considering all those goods, we add those goods and then we have the GDP. When we are observing GDP over time, the thing that we want to see if we are more productive, if we are producing more than the previous year or less, me and other economies. The problem of that is when we are observing this over time, not just production can change, but also prices, and that is a problem. Imagine an economy when you are observing that the GDP each year is higher than the previous one. You can think about, okay, if we are talking about GDP, so that means that that economy is doing a good job because each year is producing more than the years before. But if you are just considering the nominal GDP, probably that variation of the GDP is not just coming from production. Also, that economy can suffer inflation. So it's not just the production that is increasing, but also prices. Or it can be even the worst case in which the production is actually decreasing, but the prices are increasing so much that not just offset or compensate that decrease in production. In fact, they are higher. So you can have a bad estimation about the welfare or the performance of that economy, thinking that that economy is doing a good job, while instead of that, it is a disaster, because the whole thing that you are observing is not growth, it's just growth in prices. So that's why it's not good considering the nominal GDP when you are analyzing an economy over time. Instead of that, we need to consider the real GDP. So real is more connected with the real production. That is the thing that you want to evaluate over time. Then how is the way of getting that? I mean, a value that is considering the whole production, all the production in the same units, let's say monetary units, euros in our case. But when you observe that variable, the only thing that is changed is the quantity produced. It's not the price. I don't want to have that noise in my estimation of the production. What is the way of doing that? Let's fix a year. Let's call that base year, value P. It can be any year. Let's fix that year for the prices. So you are going to allow the quantity change over time, but the price that you use to quantify those goods in monetary terms, those prices don't change over time. So that is the real GDP. We have a T for the period in which you want to get the estimation of the GDP, and that is going to change with the quantity, and the base year P that is not going to change. We always are going to use the same prices. So this is like constant. In economics, we use that part to indicate that that value is not going to change in this case over time. So the thing that we are going to observe is that any time that this variable grows is because the production is growing, given the fact that prices are fixed always. So if the output, for example, if we produce more cars but the price is fixed, the whole increase of that production is coming from the number of cars, given the fact that the price is always the same. Of course, if you are estimating the real GDP for the same year of the base year, in that case nominal and real GDP is the same value. But for the next year, then the base year is going to be always the same. So you're going to have, in that case, a difference between the nominal GDP and the real GDP. In fact, the difference between the nominal GDP and the real GDP is inflation. Always that you have inflation, so higher prices, your nominal GDP is going to be higher than your real GDP. And in terms of the evolution of the nominal GDP with respect to the real GDP, that evolution, the difference, is the growth rate of prices. And the name that we give to growth rates of prices is inflation. So if you have a graph, for instance, with evolution, the growth rate of the real GDP, something like this, here, GDP. This is the real. And you have here the, let's say, growth evolution. The nominal over time, so along the time, this difference is the inflation that economy is suffering. So if you have the growth rate, I mean the evolution, the growth rate of nominal GDP minus the growth rate of real GDP, you have the estimation of the inflation, I mean the growth rate of prices.